Okay, yeah, thank you for coming at this hour and in this warm climate. I will talk about heat and the ways we can maybe conceptualize or represent heat in art, but I will take my point of departure from what is the topic of this exhibition and this festival, which is a global ecological crisis that, however, is more than just a crisis. A crisis is normally a turning point for the better. We have to balance out certain processes, and then things go back to getting better, getting more stable, and so on. What we are facing now is not just a crisis of this kind. It's not a transitory moment of, destabilization, but it is probably a moment when we cross a very specific threshold, and this cannot be made right again. In a certain way, we're entering a new state of the planet's life system, which is destabilized already, and not only in climate, in terms of climate change, but many other ecological parameters. I would therefore like to introduce a term. I'm not sure how topical that term is in Sri Lanka, or I don't know, in your in the publications that you read in the media. Who of you has heard of this term Anthropocene? Okay, yeah, that's, I'm doing kind of a sociological research about who knows this term. If you ask this in a class in my university at Vienna, I would have about a third of people knowing about it. And if you ask in America, you would have everybody, like, oh, how lame is that? We've been taking classes for the last 3 years on the Anthropocene. Now, what is the Anthropocene? The Anthropocene is a term coined by Paul Crutzen and Frederick Stormer. Crutzen is a Nobel Prize winner who's actually a climate chemist, and Stormer a biologist. And let me just quote from a paper that Crutzen wrote to make this term, to introduce this term. This is the first sentence of this very, very famous paper. You can look it up on the net. For the past 3 centuries, the effects of humans on the global environment have escalated. Because of these anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, global climate may depart significantly from natural behavior for many millennia to come. It seems appropriate to assign the term Anthropocene to the present, in many ways human-dominated geological epoch, as opposed to what we call the current geological epoch normally, and what you maybe learned in school, and which is the Holocene. So Crutzen's point is to say we have changed the life system of the planet to a degree, and in many different dimensions and elements of this life system, not just the climate, meaning the atmosphere and the flow system of the atmosphere, but also the oceans, the chemistry and the flow systems of the oceans, biotopes, species loss, invasive species, so we don't just have loss of species and biodiversity, but also we have a very uncanny form of migration of species, and so on and so forth, that we change the face of the planet to a degree that geologists in 1 million years will still see the traces of that, which is like those events in the history of the planet that changed a geological epoch. And this is why we need to think about the present as the transition from one geological epoch to another. Let me give you just a few of these dimensions. This is from another paper of on the Anthropocene. This is basically parameters of climate change, the growth of CO2 and methane rates, and oh God, now I'm losing my English here. Nitrate oxide, oxide, I think it is. Anyhow, so you see in the upper lines, you see that certain elements of the air are, or of the atmosphere are changing, and you see in the two lower lines the impact this is having on, for instance, terrestrial ecosystems, ocean ecosystems, coastal structures or water levels by melting glaciers and so on. And here you have other parameters that rather refer not so much to the effects of the life system of the Earth changing, but the forms of consumption and also of population, of, you know, the use of certain technologies, of certain forms of consumption, such as McDonald's restaurant. What you see in all these parameters is a very sharp rise beginning in the 1800s. For instance, if you look at CO2 concentration, carbon dioxide, you see it starts in the 1800s, but then it takes a very sharp rise in the 1950s, especially with certain forms of consumerism. So that would be the Anthropocene. The question that I am asking myself, because I'm not a scientist, I'm a humanities professor, as you heard, is what can we do with this, and how can we represent, perceive, debate, communicate, understand, relate to politically, economically, or solve this ecological crisis. My approach is, of course, not a scientific one. However, I need to build my ideas upon the research that has been done. So in a certain way, what we see in this whole debate is a new union or a new cooperation between the humanities, between culture and art on the one hand, and science and politics on the other hand. We need to bind this together and not just see science and humanities as two completely separated and in a certain way complementary fields. But I think that the humanities and the natural science have to talk and have to work together. So how can we represent climate change? For instance, I will, in my following remarks, focus on climate change, but I want to emphasize that the crisis is not just limited to climate change. Climate change is the dimension of the crisis where you can very well see how certain local practices, for instance, an industrial Western lifestyle, impacts the whole planet. So in a certain way, the climate here serves as a model of seeing how certain particular local practices are translated into global effects. Now, what we see here is a very specific scientific rendering of the growing of global mean surface temperature. We also see in this graph that it's a very abstract way. We just get one parameter, growth of global climates. That doesn't mean anything for a specific location. It's completely abstract. Global temperature is nothing that you can experience somewhere. All you can do is experience it in the location that you're in, and that may not mean even warmer. It may mean more rain, less rain. It may mean colder if certain atmospheric flows are disrupted, and so on. So in a certain way, this is nice and fine, and it's a fact. I'm not a climate change denier or anything, but it doesn't convey a feeling of what that really means to be living in the Anthropocene and living in a environment that is rapidly destabilizing. This is a way to kind of convey a forecast with colors that show which parts of the world are warming more than others. You can see that the Arctic and the Antarctica, the pole zones, are warming at a much more at a much faster pace than the middle zone, so to speak, but all over it's going to get warmer. You have to see this not so much as a scientific rendering, but rather as a form of popularizing scientific facts and giving a forecast, but also visualizing the warming of the planet in a certain way. Let me give you a few more examples of forms to popularize, but also to visualize the knowledge of climate change. That would be a fictitious scenario for New York in a sea level rise of, I would think, 20 meters. Most of New York is drowned, actually. Brooklyn is entirely gone. Yeah, this is one very simple way to give us a feeling for what that would mean. We take a city that we all know in a certain way. We all have seen aerial pictures of New York, and we try to imagine that 20 meters underwater. The problem with such a rendering of climate change is it looks so outlandish and so science fictional that it also makes it hard to relate to. It's like, well, when the world will look like this, I'm not going to be around anymore. You know, we kind of, if it's too crazy, it's easy to distance ourselves from these fictional forecasts or scenarios, which is a better word. The attempt to imagine what the world would look like in an advanced state of climate change. This is, on the other hand, a very real body of evidence. It's two pictures of an Austrian glacier, the Kesselwand Ferner, in the country where I live now. And you can see it's very easy to understand. There's the mass of ice, which is the white and gray stuff. Ice becomes gray in a glacier because it absorbs all sorts of dirt, or it can even look black, but that's not so good because black absorbs more heat and then it melts faster. And then you see that in 2012 the glacier has basically disappeared. Yeah. You also have attempts to politicize climate warming. The most famous attempt to do so was probably Al Gore's documentary or slideshow, as he called it, An Inconvenient Truth. He just came out with a sequel, which I haven't watched. The whole idea is also here to popularize climate change. When the Inconvenient Truth came out, this was in a phase when climate change was still very much denied in the US. In Europe, not so much, but in the US, and you know all that there's now a renewal of the denialist discourse in the US. So Al Gore is kind of on the forefront of, first of all, persuading people that climate change exists and will be a problem. The other is, and this is where I'm steering into my topic, which is heat, is the use of certain metaphors. And heat is, in a certain way, not just a fact. As I said, it's not so easy to forecast the concrete process of climate change for a given region. It might not just be just heat, it might be terrible droughts that you have already in Sri Lanka this year, I understand. It might be inundation, it might be also a cooling process. But what I observe is that heat is used as a metaphor in books that try to argue for the need of doing something about climate change. And I just gave you a couple of titles like Heat, How to Stop the Planet from Burning, Feeling the Heat, The Politics of Climate Policy, and so on and so forth. When I looked at all these books, and basically they very often don't even talk about heat and its impact for specific regions. They basically talk about what is today called climate governmentality. the attempt to come up with political solutions on the basis mostly of national agendas to have renewable energy. That is what these books are really about. They do not really talk about heat at all. Okay, now what I, as a humanities person, would suggest is an aesthetics of climate or an aesthetics of heat, but you can as well do this for the opposite, an aesthetics of coldness or of cool, of standardized climates. I wrote a couple of texts about air conditioning, which is also a front line we need to look at, how we are kind of trying to manipulate local climates, but also what are the current attempts to manipulate global climate. What I will talk about now are 2 points. First of all, a discourse history of climate that looks at the ways climates have been conceptualized. I will give you just one example from a very as you can imagine, very colonialist take on heat, which is of course associated with the tropics and what the tropics do to the colonialist white man when they go there. But that, in a certain way, is a very, very important discourse to understand what heat means in the European cultural history. The other suggestion I would like to make is an isosis of climate or an isosis of heat, meaning the ways we can aesthetically represent certain forms of heat, and also to understand what heat means in an anthropological and ontological and in a social way. So that would be the aesthetic dimensions, and I will give you a couple of examples. People working on these dimensions of heat, or what heat does to individual people, to the world, and to society. So let me start with one example of a cultural stereotype about hot and cold cultures. The inventor of this discourse is, or the invention of this discourse happens very early in the Western culture in antiquity, where even Greek philosophers started to think about why certain populations have different mentalities, and they attribute that to climate. The quotation I brought you here is from a text of this 1938 is a relatively late reprint of this thing. This is a text from the 1920s that conveys a feeling of the types of stereotypes that we had in the West to describe the impact of hot and cold climates on the mentality of people. The northern parts of the Earth are largely characterized by such essential traits as sobriety, austerity, coolness, calmness, readiness to get to work, patience, tenacity, rigor, and the consequent exertion of the understanding and the will. So rational people. This phrase sounds like a caricature of the German mind. So think of me, you know, the northerner. Okay, in the southern parts, the essential, meaning in the warm zones of any region, but also the entire Earth, the essential traits are liveliness, excitability, impulsiveness, sensitivity of the spheres of feeling and imagination, a sedate letting things go or sudden flaring up. Within a nation, its northern population is more practical. So you see, the north-south divide even works for one single nation. Helpach is German. So Germany is a relatively small country, but even within Germany, you can make this distinction between the people on the northern coast, on the sea, and then those that are close to the mountains in the south, or the Austrians, where I'm living now. We have this divide of stereotypes dividing between the southerners and the northerners, the people living in the warm and people living in the cooler climates. Within a nation, its northern population is more practical, dependable, but less open and sociable, whereas the southerners are more musical, more open, pleasant, endearing, chatty, but inconstant. So this is just an example of a centuries-long discourse of how climate affects mentalities, people, but also their social institutions, even their forms of art. This is a very, very long tradition. It basically only ends in the middle of the 20th century. There's a lot of criticism already that it's racist or it works with stereotypes. All of this is true. The one thing that I find interesting about this discourse is that it even asks, what do climates do to cultures? Or what may be the interface between climate and culture? Is there any relation? Are there any cultural practices that help people, for instance, to deal with a very punishing climate? You know, be it heat or cold, or be it like in Europe, we have a climate that is marked by extreme temperature differences. So we are totally the slaves of the seasonal cycle. Winter is a totally different thing than summer, and we change. So these stereotypes set aside, I would say what we can learn from this type of discourse is that climate does something to us. And we would want to think of our cultures and look at our everyday practices as being influenced by the climate. This is, I think, what we can learn from this discourse when we take it away from the stereotypes, may also revert it. Nobody really looks good in these stereotypes, neither the northerners nor the southerners. And you can, of course, revert them and whatnot. The whole point is to look at the relation between climate and culture. The second way we address extreme climates or extreme climate change is this is just one example that is actually dealing with heat falling over Central Europe. It's a dystopian movie by a German director that has the pun, the English pun. It's an English-German pun. Hell in German means bright, and hell in English means hell. So it's a bright hell that he's depicting, and he tries to show in which way a very brutal climate change, in this case a severe drought and a sun. You see how the guy is dressed. You can't even, look out of the window without being completely covered and wearing goggles. How this would affect not only nature but also society. This would be another way to think about it. But of course, this type of looking at dystopias of climate change is, of course, it can only highlight the extremes. It cannot really tell us anything about our everyday life and the way in which our everyday life or our travelings affect us as human beings, as bodies, as mentalities, as, regarding our psychological state and all that. Now, here's a third proposition by an American anthropologist called Michael Taussig. He traveled a lot in, his body of research is basically in Middle America. So he, being as a Northern American in Middle America, he started thinking about heat as a certain quality of perception, and what does heat, the stereotypes set aside, really do not only to the human being in the heat, but in a certain way, how does heat transform our perception? And this I find especially an aesthetically particularly fruitful approach. Taussig writes, heat is a force like color that sets aside the understanding in place of something less conscious and more overflowing. Radiance instead of line, immanence instead of that famous bird's eye view, and so on. As our planet heats up and the tropics spread, is it not possible that not only a new human body, but a new type of bodily consciousness will be created in both temperate and tropical regions? Sorry, I think I need a bit of water. As our planet heats up, and my body too, and the tropics spread, is it not possible that not only a new human body, but a new type of bodily consciousness will be created in both temperate and tropical regions, a consciousness that reattaches the body to the cosmos? So, what is he trying to say? First of all, heat is something, Tausig's idea is that heat is something that is not just outside our body, but that penetrates our body, and everybody who's in the heat knows that it actually does change our bodily state, and the way, that would be Tausig's point, the way we relate to the world. It's not just I'm hot, but I have a different relationship to what I perceive as my environment, okay? And in a certain way, being in the heat for Tausig means to kind of blend into the environment more than you would in a cooler environment. The idea would be to, and I found this with a couple of other philosophers, weirdly enough, mainly from this cultural stereotype tradition. These are the only guys, even though they might work with a lot of stereotypes, they're the only guys who think about what does hot and cold or seasonal patterns do to the body and to a person's mind. So the idea would be that while heat contracts the body and therefore emphasizes the borders, the boundaries of the body, this is me and this is the air outside. Heat kind of makes us melt into the hot air, the hot water, the hot whatever it is outside of us. It's, as he says, it's radiance instead of line. Lines are what demarcate a boundary, what is a clear-cut form, while radiance is rather a zone of influence. So, you know, it sort of changes the very predicaments of our perception, but also of our thought. That would be Tausig's point. It also changes the perspective we have on the world we are in, meaning we feel immanence, we feel our being in the space, in the environment, in the situation. Think of atmospheres as a social taste or a social fact. You feel there is something here and it penetrates me, but I also interact, I also create that atmosphere. We have a common atmosphere here right now as an audience and a speaker. Everybody's like, when is she eventually gonna stop? When will this thing be over? And then she expounds on the examples and stuff. That is an atmosphere, okay? And you create it, I create it, and we kind of penetrate without using words, without even using any kind of signs. This is here, and the fans contributed to it, the smells contribute to it, what's going on in the background, which only I can see. You know, that is atmospheres. And I think the bottom line of Tausig's argument would be we need to be more attentive to these atmospheric values as opposed to the distant, as he says, bird's eye view, the distance we usually establish in order to know something, in order to understand something. We look at it objectively. We distance ourselves from it. It's not like, in order to understand a bath or a bathtub, you want to look at it. You want to investigate, you know, its mechanics, its forms. Sitting in the bath is not so helpful, right? That would be Tausig's point. Heat helps us to assume a position of immanence, of being in something, and that enables a different type of understanding than the distance objectifying understanding of the world, of things, of social situations, of other people, and so on. Okay. Now, 3 examples for what I would like to call an eistasis of heat. First, let me explain this term eistasis. It's Greek. The European tradition, of course, loves everything Latin and Greek, and so do I. Eistasis is basically the Greek word for perception, but in a very, very rich sense. When we think of perception, normally we first think of the gaze, right? With visual perception, maybe logical understanding. And then what other forms of perception do we have? Smell, hearing, la la la. Eistasis would be the sum of all abilities of perception we have, and not just those we employ to get a distance overview of things, but it's exactly those dimensions of perception that we can only have if we are immanent, if we are in the thing. For instance, the feeling of heat on our skin, the moisture, the wind circling in this room, and so on. Now, what I have are 3 works of art. 1 literature and 2, 1 painting and 1 installation from, as you can see, very different epochs of time in the 20th century. Let me start with probably the most outlandish example. It's from a novel written by an Austrian author, came out in 1915. This is just a reprint. I think it has never been translated into English. I translated it. And it's about a trip into the tropical Amazon. And at the beginning of this trip, the narrator tries to describe his state of, his bodily state, but also his state of mind, being, you know, on a boat that is being rowed into the jungle of the Amazon. And at one point on this river, it's very, very hot, it's very, very moist, and he feels he has a déjà vu. So this heat evokes something in him that feels kind of familiar, even though he's from Austria and he has never been in any kind of tropical climate before. Oh no, he's actually, the narrator is a German engineer. So you see, he's totally the rationalist type, and all of a sudden something happens to him in the heat. All this I had already experienced once. This mild, weary water had washed around me. This illusory light, this sweetness, this mood, this dawning of the unspeakable, it was not new. It resonated with a memory in man. It was a repetition. So he has never been to this area before. He has never felt such a heat, but it evokes something to him that is inside his body like a memory. It was hot, hot. The river might even have cut across the equator. Perhaps I'm just one of the lichens that turn in the water, one with a brain, with a sick, evil brain. The fat arms of lianas hugged the overhanging trees and fed an entourage of lascivious-looking flowers. Orchids spread their little thick snouts through the knotted leaves. In the depths of my consciousness slumbered a mood from the prehistory of millions of living beings, the maternal lactation and feeding of the river, the obliging calm of idleness had gratified my simple drive. Between me and this life about me, there existed not only perhaps a metaphysical, but even a superb material identity. I am a much improved tropical landscape. Wherever I go and wherever I stand, I bring with me a normal temperature of 36 degrees, a sumptuous shooting of juices, a vegetation of warm splendor. Okay, this, I know, this is outlandish. It's from a literary epoch called German Expressionism, where metaphors abound, and these metaphors have to be always a little overbearing in a certain way, very often either images of violence or of sexuality. All this we find in here, but what we basically also find is that the experience of heat makes the narrator think about his own body and the history, the prehistory of the human species. So in a certain way, he not just melts into his environment, but he melts into the prehistory of life on the planet. And in a certain way, all of a sudden he sees how his body still contains this prehistory and this landscape around him. And he says, I am just an improved tropical landscape at constant 36 degrees. Inside of me is that landscape. In a certain way, he folds his environment into his body, but also he opens his consciousness towards a prehistory of life that needed these temperatures in a certain way as their precondition to create life. So that would be one example of how environment and the instance of observation and narration, but also a moment in time that is here and now, and a prehistory of millions of years are kind of blended together in this medium of heat experience. That would be one way to conceive of heat as this kind of mashing up of times and spaces. My next example is, in a certain way, a classic of Western painting, surrealist painter Max Ernst, who gave this title. He lived in France at the time, L'Europe après la pluie, Europe after the rain too. Its technique is a so-called decalcomanie. Basically, I did this in school, maybe you try that too, and just didn't call it decalcomanie. You use a very pasty color and smear it, and you paint with using a lot of this pasty color, like oil color, for instance, on your surface, which is ideally paper or cardboard or something that is kind of robust. And then you put a second layer of paper on top of this pasty, gooey color, and you pull it off. And there, like this, you get these patterns that look like sponges, like this is the type of pattern that you get when you use this color pull away technique with colors. Okay, everybody continue on this thing, you will see me disappear. Okay, now what's the point about heat here? I think it, again, it relates to this point that Taussig makes. What we see here are structures that are somehow organic, basically. That's all we see. But we cannot really tell what is the matter of those structures. We see in a certain way a world that is being ontologically transformed by the impact of heat into organic matter that we have a hard time identifying. We see a human figure, but the human figure has a bird's head. You see it in profile behind that thing that looks like a flag. We see something that may be a corpse, maybe a work of art, a sculpture, or just a form of decoration right behind that human figure. And we see a world that is kind of blending its matters into one another. It may be coral, it may be wood, it may be stones, it may be underwater structures. I even see water in the painting, but I'm not sure whether it really is water. So the point in this painting would be to say it's about transforming the world in this immanent way that Taussig describes, blending matters into one another and dissembling structures while still recalling what they once were. It's not just a goo that swallows everything, but the idea is that heat transforms the world, or the perception of the world, in a way that an organic matter like coral can become something else, like a human figure, or an animal, or wood, or whatever. Behind that scenery that you see is this very blue, transparent, cool sky as a backdrop of what the world is not. You see, this immanence has its space where figures can transform into one another, but then there's also a backdrop of air, of thin, light medium, where this world ends. Let me, maybe to sum up these two examples, I would say the example with Robert Müller was a way to investigate a form in which heat affects the human being. So that would be an anthropological dimension of heat. Now what I see here is, in a certain way, a work of art that deals with the ontological dimension of heat as a transformative force. Now my third example is an installation by Olafur Eliasson that, in my opinion, deals with two things that you can very easily see when you just look at this one photo. There are tons of photos, you will find them on the internet. First of all, it's technology, and secondly, it's society. You see people, and you see people gathering together in patterns or assuming certain poses. Now let me describe very briefly what you see here. This is a turbine hall of an ancient industrial space. So you see, it's an huge industrial space, and what Eliasson did was he covered the entire ceiling of this space with mirror foil. So you see a sun, but this is actually only a half sun. It's just mirrored in the ceiling, so it looks like an entirely round shape. This sun is made out of LED, light bulbs is not the right word, but LED lighting, and the whole room, you can also see that on the picture, is filled with dry ice smoke. So in a certain way, what you don't see is the technical lighting of this sun. This is all really high tech, but it's a kind of sunset. It looks like a classical sunset, and it evokes the colors of a sunset, and it also evokes the social impact that sunsets have, at least on a certain type of people like me. I get kind of, for a very short moment, that is very long actually in Europe, because sunsets take forever in the north. They can take like 6 hours if you're in Denmark in the summer. But it's a moment of meditation, or of sitting down and just looking at the sun. There's a long art historical tradition of these sunsets. What Eliasson does is he creates this by technical means, but also uses technical means to kind of blur out the technicality of that, the technological aspect. And the other thing he does is he creates an indoor sunset, which is kind of a ironic play on what we perceive as nature and what we perceive as culture. Now he creates an artificial nature inside a confined space. The thing is called the Weather Project. So in a certain way, and much of his work in general, you can see that as an attempt to create natural environments, even landscapes, in indoor spaces, and by high-tech, sometimes high-tech and sometimes not so high-tech means. But for instance, he also transports ice into, public spaces and watches it melt, you need a lot of money and you need a lot of technology to get the ice there and to produce the ice. So what does this insulation do with the people? And I think this is definitively Olafur Eliasson's main idea. This artificial nature transforms the audience and creates a new type of social behavior in this space. Everybody who went into that installation, I have never personally visited it, said the most amazing thing was that people were fascinated by this atmosphere, by this artificial atmosphere, and started making patterns. You can see it at a certain, the groups in the foreground are groups that are laying down on the ground in order to stare at this mirror ceiling, so they see themselves lying in a pattern under this reflective ceiling. So what's the whole message of this? I think Eliasson is trying to experiment with what I would call the social dimension of heat or of climate in general, in the sense that he tries to entice people to behave differently from what they would do under normal circumstances, being out in the London fog or rain or spring wind or whatnot. He tries to see how groups that may have never seen each other before react to this artificial atmosphere that he creates. So that would be my closing point about heat. Heat can be seen as one condition, definitively not the only, but maybe the most interesting condition that affects the human being as an individual, but also the human being as a species, as we can see in the reflections of the narrator of Robert Müller. Heat makes us think not only about who we are in relation to our environment, but also who we are as a species. And that leads us back to the question, what is the Anthropocene? What is the current situation where one single species on the planet has become so dominant that it's about to destroy or to destabilize the environment for many other species? The second point would be the ontological impact of heat. How does heat transform the world around us? What does it mean to live in this world? What does it mean to perceive this world under the influence of heat from a position of immanence? Not like distancing ourselves from climates, weather conditions, atmospheric vibes, but to develop a way to perceive these things much more than we do now. In Europe, we have a saying that there's no such thing as bad weather, but only the wrong clothing. And this is, I think, this saying highlights the point where we are now culturally, where we just say, oh, weather, we're not affected by it. Climate, seasons, we're not affected by it. We don't give a shit. We do our work, we do what we have to do, and if the weather gets too cold or too hot, we just use technology to rid ourselves of the influence of climate. I think we have to go to the opposite, into the opposite direction, say, like, how does the world change with a changing climate, but also what does climate do to me? What does climate do to my society? And what would be the artistic ways of representing this change? And I think this is what Eliasson is actually experimenting about. How do certain confined artificial climates impact the audience of this as a kind of test example for what it would mean to live in different climatic conditions, and what will that do to human societies? So this is the end, and I thank you very much for your patience.